All right, so with that said, what about the Old Testament passage for today? Well, this is one of my favorite stories from the Old Testament. It's from 2 Kings chapter 5. It's the famous story of the healing of Naaman the Syrian, who also happened to be a leper. Now, this is one of those times where if I was in charge of the lectionary, I would have included a lot more of the actual story. The lectionary only gives us verses 14 through 17. In other words, it gives us the ending of the story, but it doesn't give us the context. And so it's a little unfortunate because we miss out on a lot. So let me just give you the background. I'm going to give you one key verse that I think is actually really crucial for understanding Luke's gospel in context. So the story is this. Naaman is a commander of the Syrian army. So he's a Gentile. He's not from the nation of Israel. He's from the nation of Syria, who were enemies of the Israelites, the northern kingdom. But he also happens to be a leper. And he knows that there are prophets in Israel who can perform miracles. He's told this actually by an Israelite concubine of his, a slave girl who was captured in one of the wars. So he sends a message to the king of Israel asking him if he could be cured of his leprosy. And what's fascinating about this is how the king responds. In verse 7 it says this, "When the king of Israel read Naaman's letter, he tore his clothes and said, 'Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy?'" So pause there. Notice what the king of Israel's words presuppose. It presupposes that only God can cure leprosy. Other kinds of miracles can be performed, but when it comes to leprosy, that's something only God can do because it's completely impossible. All right? Very important. Basically, what the king of Israel is saying is, this guy asked me to heal him of leprosy. Who does he think I am? God? Right? That's the implication. Now, what happens is Elisha the prophet hears about this, and he comes into the king and says, "Let the king know that there is a God in Israel who can do this. Give these instructions to Naaman. Tell him to go and wash 7 times in the Jordan River. And when he has done this, he'll be cleansed." Now, when Naaman hears about this command, he's actually kind of put off because the Jordan River is basically like a glorified ditch. And he knows this. And he says, we have all kinds of wondrous rivers in my own land. Think here about the Mesopotamian valley. You've got the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates, which were actually considered to be divine, because they gave life to the whole land. They were considered sacred rivers. And so there are lots of rivers in the world that I could go to if I wanted to wash and be cleansed. And so one of his servants said to him, "Well, look, if he had told you to do something difficult, you would do it. If he tells you to do something humble and simple, why not try that also?" And that's where the reading for today really picks up. So in verse 14, it says, "So Naaman went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan River, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and he stood before him. And he said, 'Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth, but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant.' But he said, this means Elisha, said, 'As the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will receive none.' And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Then Naaman said, 'If not, I pray you, let there be given your servant 2 mules burden of earth, for henceforth your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord.'" Okay, so once you've got the context in mind, you can actually see what this story is about. It's the story not just of the healing of a leper, it's the story of the conversion of a Gentile. Because as a result of his healing, he comes to recognize that there's only one God, one true God, and that it's the God of Israel, the God who has the power to heal him of his leprosy and make his skin clean again. And this God does this at the prompting of the prophet Elisha. Press pause there. Remember who Elisha is. This is very important for understanding what's going on. Elisha is the successor of the prophet Elijah. If you remember, after Elijah is taken up into heaven on a chariot of fire, his successor, Elisha, is given a twofold portion of his spirit. This means that Elisha is actually more powerful than Elijah, his predecessor. And he performs greater miracles than Elijah. So what's going on here then is, in the Old Testament, in the scheme of things, Elisha, who is the prophet who heals Nathan, is considered as, in a sense, the greatest miracle worker in the Old Testament. If you want an example of this, later in the book of Kings, chapter 13, after Elisha dies and is buried, someone is thrown into the grave with him, and just touching his bones brings that man back from the dead. That's how holy, that's how powerful Elisha was. Now, the reason all this matters is because if you fast forward to the New Testament, you'll recall in the Gospels, Jesus identifies John the Baptist as Elijah, right? And yet Jesus is like the successor to John the Baptist. Just as Elijah was the precursor of Elisha, so John the Baptist is the precursor of Jesus. So if John the Baptist is a new Elijah, then Jesus is a new Elisha. But he's not just a new Elisha, he's greater than Elisha. So whereas Elisha only healed one leper in the Old Testament, what does Jesus, the new Elisha, do? He heals 10 lepers all at once. And they don't have to go down to the Jordan River and wash 7 times. He does it instantaneously. All they have to do is obey his word and start heading toward the temple, and they're all cleansed. This story reveals 2 things about Jesus. This Old Testament reading is a great pairing with the New Testament today. First, Jesus is a new and greater Elisha. He's performing miracles that are 10 times literally greater than the Old Testament miracle. But even more than that, second, he's also a divine Savior, right? Because think about it, in the Old Testament, what did it say? Who can cure leprosy directly? It's God, right? Am I God that I can heal this man of his leprosy? What does Jesus do in the New Testament? Unlike Elisha, he doesn't have to send the man down to the river and wash and do all these different things. Jesus heals the man directly and immediately. And so it's just a hint, but there's a hint of the revelation of Jesus' divinity. If you know the Old Testament, you know that only God can cure lepers, then it begs the question, who is this Jesus who heals 10 lepers at once? And the answer comes to you when the leper comes back to him and falls prostrate before him and gives him thanks for what he has done.